Hey everyone, just so glad that you could join. Hopefully, there is some people tuning in. Sorry, it took a little while, just took a bit to get things going, but glad to be with you on this Good Friday, even though it is very different than what we're used to. But it is still, no matter what's going on, uh, that it is a Good Friday. And so I want to discuss today just a little bit about and answer the question as I posted yesterday. Why is Good Friday good? As we celebrate each and every year this remembrance, we often get together in a joint service. We carry the cross. We remember his crucifixion, his suffering, all that he went through for us. Why is it called good when oftentimes in many different cultures, uh, German being one of them, in Germany, this day is called Sorrowful Friday. And it was a sorrowful day if you looked at it from the world's perspective and even from the perspective of the disciples and those in Jerusalem at that time. It was very sorrowful that Jesus died and he was mocked and beaten, scourged for us in our place. But in light of biblical prophecy, in light of history, the solemnness of that moment, the sorrowfulness, really reflect the greatest act of love that we could ever have even thought of. That it was a history changer, and God had planned this from the very beginning, as we read in Genesis chapter 3. Wonderful words there of Satan striking the heel, but Jesus being the one who strikes the head. The suffering death of Jesus Christ was truly the culmination of that plan that took place right after the fall of man in the garden. And what a wonderful plan that was, the plan of love, plan of goodness, the good plan of God that we see written all the way from Genesis through to Revelation. The very essence of God himself, as we think of the word good, is good. Who God is good. Whatever God does, whatever God says, is good. As he said in the creation account, after every day, he created things and he saw that it was good. So everything that God does, everything that God says is good. Did you know that throughout the entire scripture, entire Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, that there's the word good is used approximately 820 times? 820 times. Wow, both in the Hebrew and the Greek. Ultimately, what God has said and inspired is good, and what he has created is good. His plan is good. The very message that we as Christians believe, the good news, the euangelion, as the Greek says, is at the heart of what Good Friday is all about. Jesus came and he lived a sinless life, a perfect life. And at the very time that he was dying on the cross was the time of Passover, when the Passover lamb, which was Passover was the remembrance of what the nation of Israel went through as they escaped the bondage of the oppressors in Egypt. At the very time when Jesus was dying on the cross and shedding his blood, the Passover lamb too was being sacrificed in remembrance of that release from bondage. That wonderful, good, and beautiful time that was very hard, but yet wonderful for the nation of Israel. Then, for the entire world and all of humanity, Christ, the Passover lamb, was sacrificed. What a good and wonderful message that is. Jesus came in order to suffer, in order to die for our sin or wrongdoing of each of and every one of us. God is not afraid. I want all of us to hear this today. God is not afraid to enter into our suffering. Both Jesus and Paul speak to us about this. We read these words in the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 27 and 28. Then I will continue to read in Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. John 12 says, "Now my soul is deeply troubled. Should I pray, Father, save me from this hour? But this is the very reason I came. Father, bring glory to your name." Then a voice spoke from heaven saying, "I have already brought glory to my name, and I will do so again." It was for God's glory that he wanted to restore a relationship with us. We see in Romans 5:6-8 these words: "When we were utterly helpless, Christ came at just the right time and died for us sinners. Now most people would not be willing to die for an upright person, though someone might perhaps be willing to die for a person who is especially good. But God showed his great love for us by sending Christ to die for us while we were still sinners." Why did Jesus die? To identify with our suffering, to identify with and to take away and to be the ultimate sacrifice for our sin, and to take away the shame of sin. What a wonderful, good act. Jesus, being the very nature of God, suffered in our place. He didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking on the form of a servant, Paul said in Philippians, and even going to death on the cross. This is the greatest example of what goodness could be. It's the epitome of goodness. Many other religions, like Islam especially, see suffering, a divine figure, a God figure, suffering as weakness. Why would God suffer and be tortured? Why would he do that? Buddhism is another religion that tries to get beyond suffering to a place of utopia. Suffering is not seen as something that is ideal in Buddhism. So what is good? How do we answer that question on this being Good Friday? That which benefits, that which makes something well, is what author James Bryan Smith says. That which benefits, that which makes something well. We are made well through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. Another way to understand this goodness and this Good Friday is through looking at two perspectives. And Professor and author Vince Vitale of the Ravi Zacharias Ministries brings us a perspective on that and can help us today in thinking about that. He brings it into two categories: goodness explained and goodness displayed. Goodness explained and goodness displayed. Goodness explained is taking the perspective of knowing why, how and why God allows suffering in this world. Vince Vitale writes these words: "One reason why God allows suffering is so that he can create and love a specific community of persons, a community that includes you and me. He allows suffering, and he has entered into our suffering through Jesus Christ. That is goodness explained. Goodness displayed comes from a thought out of my own life and a deep experience of joy and suffering at the same time. Almost 2 years ago, within a couple weeks here, my wife Sherry gave birth to our third child, Rebecca. And after the birth of our child, after Rebecca was born, Sherry had to have surgery. As she was waiting for her surgery, complications were happening. And it's interesting, the doctor actually stopped by and was coming by, the doctor on call, as Sherry began to bleed profusely while waiting for surgery. And I still see that as God's timing, as this doctor then rushed her into surgery. And I got a call from the head nurse. I had just slipped out for a quick meal after a day of being with Sherry in the hospital. And this head nurse said to me, "I need your permission." She was very direct with me, to have a blood transfusion for your wife, as she's lost a large amount of blood. And of course, I said yes immediately, and she very directly and sternly said to me, "You need to get back to the hospital." And so I came directly back. And it's interesting as all this took place. I thought about this in this week and this day. If that head nurse or that doctor had said, you know, well, she needs surgery for this or for that, and it was just, I didn't quite understand why, but I did understand why. I knew why. But had that nurse or doctor said, we're going to give our blood to your wife to save her life. Wow, what an act of love, extreme love. That would have been, I don't know whose blood Sherry has or took, but it did save her life. But that story shows goodness displayed in that way that and as Romans says, most of us wouldn't die for our friends, let alone like Jesus, who died for us as we were his enemies, as we were dead in our trespasses and sins. What goodness, the ultimate epitome of goodness is displayed on Good Friday, that we remember this day, that he died for us, that he shed his blood for us, that he was willing to suffer in our place. Wow. And he took on our shame, and yet he, from the cross, did not cry out in spite against his persecutors. He said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Vince Vitale writes this: "When he saw us hurting and in need of healing, he provided his own blood. He chose to join us in our suffering and to take on himself whatever suffering was necessary for us to be healed. He displayed his love in such a way that was extravagant, that we have a strong reason to trust him, even when we don't fully understand his ways. I trusted the doctors and the nurse who operated on my wife, and she's here 2 years later because of that. And I am so grateful for that. But Jesus came and gave his life for us in our place, that we may gain life, that we may have forgiveness of sin. He said the last 3 words he said to us before he died was, "It is finished." Wow. Meditate on those words today. There's nothing we can do to achieve the goodness that he brought for us, the epitome of goodness, the epitome of that bridging that relationship that sin had broken down, that chasm of sin that Adam and Eve, through their choice, had made, that the blood of goats and bulls down through the years in the nation of Israel atoned for a short time, but Jesus' blood atones for all time that sin that we have. We have just to confess it to him, and his blood covers that sin. What a wonderful message for us today. His broken body, his blood brings out the ultimate goodness, the ultimate love of what God desires for us as people today. So maybe today, as you watch this, as you hear this, you're struggling, as we have this pandemic that we continue to face, and that we are all isolated. We cannot gather together. Know that Jesus himself was isolated from the Father as he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was isolated because he loved us so much that he took on the sin of humanity upon himself. Wow, what a weight. Yet as he was on the cross, he went to the cross willingly. He was not forced to go. Think of that for a while. Meditate on that as we go through this Good Friday day. We often say that the cross is here, but Sunday's coming. We see Good Friday in light of Easter Sunday. There is a solemnness, but yet there is a wonderful goodness to know that, yes, Christ died, but we will gather together in a very different way in a couple of days to share and celebrate his resurrection. He overcame sin and death for us so that we may have eternal life and genuine joy now in the midst of this crisis that we are in, we can have that genuine joy and love. To know that he accomplished it. He overcame. And he says these words to us, and I say these words to all of us as we close our time together today. He overcame. He says, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world. Jesus overcame the world. He overcame sin and death as he took them all on himself on the cross and rose again 3 days later. So why is Good Friday called good? Well, you can see all that Jesus did, all that God had in store, all of his wrath, all of the sin of humanity was placed upon Jesus. And again, from a person in the first century, maybe that day wasn't so good. But as we look back in hindsight, and we have the gift of hindsight, that Good Friday is good because of what Jesus did for us. It is goodness explained, and ultimately it's goodness displayed. So I encourage you today, continue to think about Jesus' goodness and all that he did, the ultimate act of love. That is why Good Friday is good. Thank you all for tuning in, and encourage you, praying for each and every one of you. If you have a prayer need, if you have anything that you have a question, write it below here in the Facebook page for Faith Community Baptist Church. We're glad to be able to help you. If you need anything else, please contact the church in the coming days and weeks as we continue to walk through this time together. Love you all, praying for you all. It's been great to be with you, and thanks for tuning in.